Number 10. The Cardiff Giant. To understand how a 3,000-pound gypsum statue fooled a nation, you have to understand the argument that started it. The year is 1867. A cigar maker named George Hull travels from Binghamton, New York to a family visit in Iowa, and while he is there, he ends up at a Methodist revival meeting listening to a reverend named Mr. Turk. Hull is an atheist. Turk is a fundamentalist. They collide, as they were always going to collide, over a passage in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days. Turk insists the verse must be read literally. Hull, seething at what he sees as the credulity of the American Christian, walks away from that revival tent with a thought so cynical and so brilliant, it will make him a fortune. If they want giants, he decides, I will give them a giant. Hull spends the next 2 years and roughly $2,600, the equivalent of about $63,000 today, executing the most elaborate practical joke in American history. He hires quarrymen in Fort Dodge, Iowa, to cut out an 11-foot block of gypsum. He tells them he needs it for a monument to Abraham Lincoln in New York, because if you're going to lie, you may as well drape it in the flag. The block is shipped by rail to Chicago, where Hull commissions a German stone carver named Edward Burghardt to sculpt it into the figure of a naked man, hunched, contorted in what looks like agony. Hull himself poses for the face. It is his own features, roughly, that go into the giant's dead stone expression. Then comes the aging. Burghardt attacks the surface with steel knitting needles hammered through a wooden board to simulate skin pores. He drenches the whole thing in sulfuric acid to give it that vintage weathering, that impossibly ancient patina. In November of 1868, Hull ships the finished giant in an iron-sealed crate to Cardiff, New York, to the farm of his cousin, William C. Newell, nicknamed Stubb. Under cover of a moonless night, they bury it beside the barn, wedge it under tree roots to make it look like the ground itself has claimed the body over centuries. Then they wait. Almost a full year passes. On October 16th, 1869, Newell hires 2 workmen, Gideon Emmons and Henry Nichols, ostensibly to dig a well behind his barn. They break the surface, they dig down, and about 3 feet in, one of the shovels rings against stone. Emmons reportedly cries out, "I declare some old Indian has been buried here." Within 48 hours, the field is a circus. Newell throws a tent over the giant and charges 25 cents, then 50 cents, then $1. Special trains from Syracuse are running excursion tickets to the middle of nowhere. Wagons choke the country lanes. Fundamentalist preachers seize on the discovery as literal biblical proof, exactly as Hull had hoped. One Syracuse minister writes, "Is it not strange that any human being can deny the evidence of his senses and refuse to believe that we have here a fossilized human being? Perhaps one of the giants mentioned in Scripture?" Yale paleontologist Othniel C. Marsh visits and immediately calls it a humbug. He points out that gypsum dissolves in wet earth. It would not have survived a single wet season buried in that field, let alone a millennium. Chisel marks are still visible on the surface, but nobody wants to hear from Yale. They want to see the giant. And then P.T. Barnum enters the story. Barnum offers $50,000, later reported as $60,000, for a 3-month lease. The syndicate that has now bought a share in the giant from Hull for around $37,500, led by a Syracuse banker named David Hannum, refuses, so Barnum does what Barnum does. He hires a man to secretly model the giant's shape, in wax produces a plaster replica, and puts his fake of a fake on display in Manhattan. He declares his giant the real one and the Cardiff Giant a hoax. Hannum sues. It is here that the story turns from history into farce. The judge listens to Hannum's complaint that Barnum has been calling his giant a fake. Then the judge tells Hannum that if his giant is willing to swear to its own genuineness in court, he'll grant an injunction. On December 10th, 1869, Hull confesses everything to the press. On February 2nd, 1870, the court rules that both giants are fakes and that P.T. Barnum cannot be sued for calling a fake giant a fake. It is an American ruling made of pure American logic. And somewhere in that mess, David Hannum, watching Barnum's replica draw crowds anyway, is reported to have said the line that would haunt show business forever. There's a sucker born every minute. History would later hand that quote to Barnum because history is not always fair to the losers. The original Cardiff Giant eventually ended up as a coffee table in an Iowa newspaper publisher's basement before being sold to the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, where it lies today. Barnum's fake of a fake is displayed at Marvin's Marvelous Mechanical Museum outside Detroit. Two hoaxes, both preserved, both in their way monuments to what happens when a country desperately wants an ancient wonder to be true. Number 9. The Crystal Skulls. In the 1860s, a French antiquities dealer named Eugene Boban walks the streets of Mexico City selling wonders. Some of what he sells is real Aztec figurines, Mixtec pottery, genuine pre-Columbian jade. But mixed in among the authentic material is something else. Something Boban is quietly commissioning from craftsmen in the German gemstone town of Idar Oberstein on the far side of the Atlantic. Crystal skulls, life-sized, human-sized, carved from single blocks of translucent quartz, hollowed and shaped and polished until they look like translucent ghosts staring out from empty eye sockets. Boban tells his buyers these skulls are Aztec ancient, ritualistic. Priests, he suggests, once channeled divine power through them. And for over a century, museums believe him. In 1897, one crystal skull ends up in the British Museum, another gets purchased by Tiffany & Co., then donated to the Smithsonian in 1906, a third arrives at the Trocadero Museum in Paris, later relocated to the Musée du Quai Branly. There are more. Boban is estimated to have sold at least 5 crystal skulls to various institutions across Europe and the Americas. They sit behind glass. Docents describe them in hushed tones to visiting schoolchildren. They inspired New Age movements, occult conspiracies, and eventually an entire Indiana Jones film with Harrison Ford chasing extraterrestrials through the jungle. All of it is a lie. The unraveling begins slowly. In 1885, when Boban tries to sell a crystal skull through his shop in Mexico City, the National Museum of Mexico rejects it as a modern fake. Boban, sensing the walls closing, packs up and moves to New York to keep selling. Then, in 1992, an anonymous package arrives at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Inside is a giant, life-sized crystal skull. There is no letter of provenance, just a note claiming it had been purchased in Mexico in 1960. That donation triggers something. Jane McLaren Walsh, an anthropologist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, decides to take a serious scientific look at the skulls in her own collection in the British Museum and eventually at the Quai Branly. What she finds is definitive. Under an electron microscope, the surface of each skull tells a story that no Aztec priest could have written. The tool marks are wrong. Pre-Columbian Mesoamerican craftsmen carved hard stones with hand tools using abrasive powders and slow patient friction. The crystal skulls show something else entirely. Rotary wheel marks. The kind of concentric circular striations left by jewelers' lathes, spinning grinding wheels driven by a foot pedal, or later, by an electric motor. Technology that did not exist in Mesoamerica. Technology that only existed in Europe in workshops like the ones in Idar Oberstein from the 19th century onward. On the Smithsonian skull specifically, researchers detected traces of a modern synthetic abrasive called silicon carbide, or carborundum. Carborundum was not synthesized until 1892. The Aztecs had access to a lot of remarkable things, but chemistry from the Industrial Revolution was not one of them. Then came the quartz itself. Analysis of the crystal used in the British Museum, and Smithsonian skulls indicated that the source was Brazil, Madagascar, or the European Alps, all areas well outside any Aztec or Mixtec trade network. The Aztecs simply did not have access to blocks of quartz that size from those geological sources at any point in their history. The 2009 study on the Quai Branly skull, published in Applied Physics A, confirmed the same story. Rotary tool marks, modern abrasives, a suspiciously perfect, mechanically precise set of teeth, which contrasted sharply with the more human proportions on the rest of the head. All of them, without exception, were forgeries. Walsh's archival research finally traced the paper trail. Bobin had sold the British Museum skull, the Kay Branley skull, and multiple others. He had passed them off through art dealers and collectors using invented backstories about ancient Aztec priests and hidden temples. His big-ticket items, as one researcher put it, were for the most part fake. The most famous crystal skull in popular culture, the so-called Mitchell-Hedges skull, has similar problems. It was claimed to have been discovered in 1924 by a teenage girl named Anna Mitchell-Hedges inside a Maya ruin in Belize. Documentary evidence has since shown her father actually purchased the skull at a Sotheby's auction in London in 1943. And so the truth stands. Every single life-size crystal skull in every major museum collection is not what it was labeled. The British Museum's has been relabeled as probably European, 19th century. The Quay Branley and the Smithsonian have quietly reclassified theirs. And every time you have seen a documentary insisting that these skulls contain ancient power, that they hum with mystic frequencies, that they were carved by lost civilizations using techniques modern science cannot explain, the truth is this. They were carved by German craftsmen in a Rhineland gemstone workshop in the 1860s and sold by a French conman to museums that wanted the story more than they wanted the facts. Number 8. The Amarna Princess. In 2003, the Bolton Museum in Greater Manchester, England, makes an announcement that stops the archaeology world in its tracks. They have purchased, for £440,000, a stunning 20-inch alabaster statuette of an Egyptian princess. She is carved in the distinctive Amarna style, that unusual flowing elongated aesthetic that only existed during the reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BC. The statuette is missing her arms and lower legs, which is exactly right. It matches, almost too precisely, the fragmentary style of surviving Amarna period sculpture. The British Museum authenticates the piece as 3,300 years old. Christie's had valued a similar object at around £1 million. Bolton has, they proudly announce, scored a coup. A regional English museum has landed one of the most significant Egyptian acquisitions in decades, except the princess isn't 3,300 years old. She is about 3 weeks old when Bolton buys her, and she was carved in a garden shed in a modest council house in a Bolton suburb called Bromley Cross by a 40-something man named Sean Greenhalgh. Greenhalgh lives with his elderly parents, George Sr. and Olive, and together they run what British newspapers would later call the Garden Shed Gang. The operation is one of the most improbable art forgery rings in modern history. Sean does the actual work. He carves stone, molds silver, paints canvases, and forges everything from Assyrian reliefs to Barbara Hepworth sculptures to Roman lankstitches to Anglo-Saxon reliquaries. His elderly parents handle the front end. His mother, Olive, answers the door. His father, George Sr., a stooped, unassuming man in his 80s who looks like the last person on earth capable of criminal conspiracy, walks into museums holding fake antiques wrapped in newspaper and tells stories. He tells auctioneers he found the object in his garden. He tells curators it has been in the family for generations. He tells experts that a great-uncle bought it in Egypt in the 1890s. Sean's brother, George Jr., handles the money. For nearly 3 decades, this family manages to sell hundreds of forgeries to museums, galleries, and private collectors around the world. Their client list allegedly includes the Art Institute of Chicago, the Henry Moore Foundation, the British Museum, and one American president. The Amarna Princess is their masterpiece. To make her plausible, the Greenhalghs buy a 19th century sale catalog from Silverton Park, the Devon estate of George Wyndham, the 4th Earl of Egremont, at auction. Buried in that 1892 catalog, in the list of items sold off from the Earl's collection, is a vague reference to Egyptian antiquities. The Greenhalghs use this document to construct a story. Sean carves the princess in alabaster in the family shed over about 3 weeks. George Sr. approaches Bolton Museum and says the family owns an ancient Egyptian statue that had been in his grandfather's collection, purchased at the Silverton Park sale in 1892. He has the catalog to prove the family connection. Bolton is enchanted. They send the piece to the British Museum for authentication. Experts examine it. They cannot fault the style, the carving, or the material. They date it to the Amarna period. Bolton Council raises the £440,000 through lottery grants and private donations. The princess goes on display. For 3 years, she stands behind glass while visitors marvel at how a regional museum acquired a masterpiece. What finally undoes the greenhougs is not the princess. It is another job. In 2005, they present 3 Assyrian stone reliefs to Barnum's auction house in London, claiming they too came from the Silverton Park estate. Barnum sends the reliefs to the British Museum for verification. And that is when the entire fraud collapses. Because carved into one of the Assyrian reliefs is a line of cuneiform text. Cuneiform, the 3,000-year-old wedge script of Mesopotamia, and there is a spelling error in it, an absent diacritical mark, a small but glaring inconsistency that would have been essentially impossible in a real royal Assyrian relief made for the eyes of a king. The horse's reins in the carving are also wrong, inconsistent with genuine Assyrian iconography. The British Museum flags the pieces. Scotland Yard's Arts and Antiquities unit, it's involved. In March of 2006, they impound the Amarna Princess. In November of 2007, the family is charged. Sean Greenhow gets 4 years and 8 months in prison. His father, George Sr., by then 84 years old, receives a suspended sentence. Olive receives no custodial sentence due to her age. During the investigation, police raid the family home and find the shed. Inside are the tools, half-finished forgeries, drying molds, and a note written by Sean outlining the next 3 years of planned projects. The Amarna Princess is now displayed at Bolton Museum, but not as an Egyptian antiquity. She sits in an exhibition of fakes and forgeries, a monument to the family that outcrafted the experts of the British Museum and got caught by a single misplaced wedge in a script most of the world can't read. Sean Greenhow was released from prison in 2010. He has since written a memoir. He now legitimately produces artwork for the BBC, and he insists in interviews that he never set out to fool anyone. He was simply making things his parents could sell. Number 7. The Etruscan Terracotta Warriors, New York City, 1933. The Metropolitan Museum of Art unveils 3 monumental terracotta warriors sculpted in the archaic Etruscan style. There is the old warrior, roughly 6 feet 7 inches tall, with a white beard and an almost skeletal ascetic body that critics would later compare to a Giacometti sculpture. There's the colossal head, over 4 feet tall, suggesting that whatever body it belonged to must have stood over 22 feet high, a temple guardian of unheard of scale. And there is the big warrior, 8 feet tall, armored, and holding a spear. Together, the 3 warriors dominate the Etruscan gallery. They rewrite the scholarly understanding of ancient Italian sculpture. The Met's celebrated curator of Greek and Roman antiquities, Gisela M.A. Richter, publishes a major monograph in 1937 arguing that these warriors have given us a new vision of Etruria in the late Archaic period. The warriors show us, she writes, Etruria's triumphant strength during her prime. For nearly 3 decades, they are among the most photographed and reproduced ancient sculptures in the Western world. They also, as it turns out, were made in a farmhouse in the Italian hill town of Orvieto by 4 men. The story begins in 1908, when the British Museum purchases what is presented to them as a genuine ancient Etruscan chariot recovered from a fort near Orvieto. The chariot has been discovered by an Italian family named Riccardi, who claim they were commissioned to clean and restore the object. In truth, the Riccardis had made it themselves. Pio Riccardi and his brother, along with several cousins, ran a workshop producing convincing Etruscan-style forgeries. Pio dies shortly after the British Museum purchase. His sons and cousins carry on the business. They enlist a young sculptor named Alfredo Fioravanti, born in 1886, a specialist in ceramic repair, who has spent his life around ancient Etruscan pieces and knows the style intimately. Together, the group produces the old warrior around 1915. They cannot fire an intact 6-foot terracotta figure because they don't have a kiln large enough. So they break the statue into pieces, fire each fragment separately, then reassemble them and disguise the joins with plaster and pigment. The result is delivered to a Roman antiquities dealer named Pietro Stettiner, who sells it through the Met's Italian purchasing agent John Marshall to Gisela Richter for the Met. In 1916, they sell her the colossal head, then eventually the massive big warrior. The forgery is so convincing that even a decade later, in 1936, when an Italian art dealer named Pietro Tosi personally warns Gisela Richter that the warriors are fakes and gives her the names Riccardi and Fioravanti as the forgers, she dismisses him. The Met has staked its reputation on these pieces. It is not about to admit an error, and so the warriors stay on display for another 24 years. What finally corrects the case is not a scholar, it is a chemist. In 1960, technical analysis on the black glaze covering the warriors reveals traces of manganese. Manganese was routinely used in glazes from the 17th century onward, particularly in Renaissance and later ceramics. It was never used by the Etruscans, not once. Ancient Etruscan black glaze relies on iron oxides and specific reducing atmospheres in the kiln. The manganese is a smoking gun. Additional testing reveals that fragments of the warriors had been broken before firing, then rejoined. A colossal 8-foot warrior could not have been fired in one piece by any known ancient kiln in Etruria. The physical evidence pins the warriors to the modern era, but scientific evidence alone might not have been definitive. What made it definitive happened on January 5th, 1961. On that day, in Rome, a now elderly man in his mid-70s walks into the United States consulate. His name is Alfredo Fioravanti. He asks to make a sworn statement. And then, before an American consular official, he signs a written confession that he and the Riccardis had produced the 3 Metropolitan Museum warriors between 1914 and 1918. He explains the fragmentation method, he describes the aging process, he names his co-conspirators. Then, from his pocket, he produces something small. A left thumb, made of the same baked pottery as the old warrior, which he has kept for himself as a memento for over 40 years. A curator named Dietrich von Bothmer flies from New York to Rome to meet Fioravanti. Von Bothmer brings with him a plaster cast of the old warrior's left hand, from which the thumb is missing. Fioravanti places his thumb against the plaster hand. It fits perfectly. On February 15, 1961, the Metropolitan Museum of Art issues a public statement acknowledging that the 3 Etruscan terracotta warriors are modern forgeries. They are quietly removed from the galleries. Today they sit in storage, available only to scholars and researchers, a reminder of what happens when a great institution wants to believe more than it wants to verify. And Alfredo Fioravanti died in 1963, 2 years after his confession, having outlived the fame of the forgeries he built with his own hands. Number 6. The Tiara of Saitaphernes. April 1st, 1896. The Louvre Museum in Paris announces the acquisition of a magnificent Scythian gold tiara. It was, they say, presented to a Scythian king named Saitaphernes by the Greek colony of Olbia on the shores of the Black Sea, sometime in the late 3rd century. BC, an inscription in ancient Greek circles, the crown, the council and citizens of Olbia honor the great and invincible King Saitaphernes. The tiara is astonishing. Made of hammered gold sheet, it is decorated with intricate scenes from Homer's Iliad alongside vivid depictions of Scythian daily life. Children learning archery, horses being sacrificed, winged beasts, and exotic flora. It is a treasure of unparalleled beauty and historical importance. The Louvre pays 200,000 gold francs for it. That is roughly equivalent to several $1 million today. The French press erupts with pride. Le Figaro calls it one of the greatest acquisitions in the museum's history. Scholars from across Europe travel to Paris to study the crown. Scientists from the Imperial Museum in Vienna and the British Museum have already examined the tiara and confirmed its authenticity. There is only one problem. The tiara was made 2 years earlier in 1894 in a jeweler's workshop in the port city of Odessa on the Black Sea. And the jeweler who made it is not at first aware that his work is being sold as an ancient antiquity. His name is Israel Ruchamovsky. He is a small, quiet, meticulous goldsmith, considered by some contemporaries, including Peter Carl Fabergé himself, to be one of the greatest metalworkers alive. In 1894, two brothers named Shapshel and Leba Hochman, both antiquities dealers of questionable reputation, come to Ruchamovsky's workshop with a commission. They want him to make a Scythian-style gold tiara. It is intended, they tell him, as a gift for an archaeologist friend of theirs in Kharkov. To help him get the details right, they provide Ruchamovsky with archaeological texts, atlases of Greek and Scythian artifacts, catalogs of recent excavations. Ruchamovsky spends 7 to 8 months hammering and engraving the tiara. He studies each of the scenes he is copying with the discipline of a scholar. He replicates them faithfully. Some of the scenes he uses are so obscure they were pulled from a medal discovered in the Rhone region of France in 1656. He completes the tiara. The Hochmans pay him roughly 1,800 to 2,000 rubles, a substantial sum for the goldsmith, but a fraction of what the Louvre would ultimately pay. Then the tiara disappears from his life. The Hochmans quietly transport it to Europe. In Vienna, they show it to scientists at the Imperial Museum, who authenticate it. The Imperial Museum wants it, but cannot afford the price. Then the tiara goes to London. The British Museum also authenticates it, but similarly cannot come up with the money. Finally, through an antiquarian named Anton Vogel and a broker, the tiara reaches the Louvre. The French, terrified of losing such a treasure to another nation, snap it up. And for 7 years, it is one of the crown jewels of the Louvre's classical collection. Skeptics begin whispering almost immediately. In Germany, an archaeologist named Adolf Furtwängler denounces the tiara as a fraud. He points out anomalies in the iconography. Some of the scenes contain compositional details that do not match any known Scythian or Greek stylistic conventions. The French experts refuse to hear it. They insist Furtwängler is motivated by German-French rivalry. The story might have ended there, with the fake sitting in the Louvre forever, except that the Russian press picks up the German accusations. Newspapers in Odessa begin discussing the tiara. And one day, in early 1903, a friend of Ruchamovsky's happens to see a picture of the Louvre tiara in a newspaper. He recognizes it. He knows exactly who made it. He tells Ruchamovsky. The goldsmith is horrified. He had no idea his commissioned piece was now being displayed as an ancient royal artifact in one of the most famous museums in the world. Ruchamovsky travels to Paris in March of 1903 and presents himself to the Louvre. He tells them the entire story, the commission from the Hochmans, the 7 months of work, the archaeological books they provided. The Louvre refuses to believe him. Impossible, they say. This tiara is ancient. Ruchamovsky then does something extraordinary. He asks for a sheet of solid gold, tools, and a workshop. He proposes to reproduce a section of the tiara from memory under Louvre supervision to prove that he made it. The Louvre, backed into a corner, agrees. Ruchamovsky begins working. Halfway through his reproduction, the Louvre officials look at what he is producing and realize with sinking hearts that this modest goldsmith from Odessa can absolutely make another tiara. They have been fooled. The story explodes in the French press. Satirical postcards depict the tiara with a modern price tag. Cartoonists have a field day. The Louvre quietly removes the tiara from public display and moves it to storage where it remained, with brief exceptions, to this day. But here's the strangest twist. Ruchamovsky himself becomes famous. The Paris art world adores him. He is awarded a gold medal at the Paris Salon of Decorative Arts. He is celebrated not as a forger, but as an artist so skilled he fooled the world's greatest museum. He settles in Paris and lives there until his death in 1934. The Tiara of Saitaphernes was reintroduced to the public briefly in 1954 in the Louvre's Hall of Forgeries. And in 1997, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem borrowed it for an exhibition celebrating Ruchamovsky's work. A treasure, then a fraud, then a work of art, the same object, judged 3 different ways in 100 years depending entirely on what people had decided to believe about it. Number 5. The Getty Kouros. In September of 1983, an antiquities dealer named Gianfranco Vicina walks into the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles with something extraordinary: a 6-foot, 8-inch marble statue of a nude young man. A Kouros. The Kouros, in Greek sculpture, is a specific type of standing male figure from the Archaic period, roughly the 6th century BC. Only 12 complete examples exist in the world. If this one is genuine, it would be the 13th and one of the finest ever discovered. Getty curator Jerry Farrell accepts the Kouros on loan for examination. What follows is one of the strangest, most contested authentication processes in modern museum history. The Kouros is examined by more than 30 experts. The consensus, initially, is that it is real. The stylistic proportions align with known, archaic Greek sculpture. The stone, dolomitic marble, appears geologically correct. Most importantly, scientific analysis of the surface reveals a chemical process called dedolomitization. The surface layer of the marble shows that magnesium has leached out of the calcium magnesium carbonate, leaving a distinctive weathered patina called calcite. This process, geologists at the time argued, could only occur naturally over hundreds or even thousands of years. That single finding is treated as definitive. In January of 1985, the Getty Museum Board approves the purchase for a reported $9 to $10 million. The Kouros goes on public display in October of 1986, and within weeks, half the classical art world is screaming that it is a fake. The critiques begin immediately. Federico Zeri, one of Italy's leading art historians, denounces it publicly. Evelyn Harrison, a top expert on archaic Greek sculpture, questions the proportions. Thomas Hoving, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum, writes an entire article calling the piece a fake. The criticisms center on what art historians call the head-to-foot problem. The head of the Getty Kouros belongs stylistically to one region and era of archaic Greece. The feet belong to a different region. Nothing about the sculpture matches any known workshop tradition. It is, in the words of one expert, a sculpture that does not look right. Just does not look right. And here's where the story turns from art history into detective work. Because the Getty had received documentation with the Kouros, suggesting that it had been in a Swiss private collection since around 1930, owned by a man named Jean Laufenberger. Included with the sale were photocopied letters supposedly written to Laufenberger authenticating the Kouros. One letter, dated 1952, was allegedly from Ernst Langlotz, a respected German classical scholar. Another letter, dated 1955, was from a Swiss art restorer named A.E. Biggenwald, who Laufenberger had supposedly consulted about repairs to the Kouros. The photocopies were shown to a German document expert to verify their authenticity. The result was catastrophic for the Getty. The 1952 Langlotz letter carried a postal code on its letterhead. That postal code system had not been introduced in Germany until 1972, 20 years after the letter was allegedly written. The 1955 Biggenwald letter referenced a bank account. Investigators traced the account number. It had not been opened until 1963. 8 years after the letter supposedly mentioning it, both letters were forgeries. The paper trail was fake, and Laufenberger's own surviving family members had no recollection of the Kouros ever being in his collection. Then the scientific case fell apart. In the years after the acquisition, researchers demonstrated that the dedolomitization process on the marble surface could be artificially induced in a matter of weeks by soaking marble in a solution containing potato mold and various acids. What had once seemed like proof of centuries of natural aging could actually be produced in a modern lab in the time it takes for potatoes to rot. In 1992, the Getty hosted a colloquium bringing together experts from around the world to try to reach a verdict. They could not. Some remained convinced the Kouros was ancient. Others were certain it was a modern forgery. The Getty's own label, for decades, became a monument to institutional embarrassment. It read simply, Kouros, Greek, about 530 BC, or modern forgery, neither confirmation nor denial. Then in 2018, Getty director Timothy Potts made the announcement the Kouros was being removed from display due to its disputed authenticity. It sits now in storage. Nobody knows for certain whether the statue is 2,500 years old or 40 years old. What is known is that the documentary provenance was manufactured. What is known is that the aging can be faked. And what is known is that a museum paid $9 to $10 million for a sculpture whose story about its own past could not survive contact with a German postal inspector. There is no definitive verdict. There may never be. And that in itself is the verdict. Number 4, the Shapira Scrolls. This is the tragedy. Every hoax on this list involves deception. But number 4 involves something else. The possibility that a man was denounced as a forger for something that may have been real and that he shot himself over a scandal that should never have existed. In 1878, a Jerusalem Antiquities dealer named Moses Wilhelm Shapira acquires from a Bedouin tribesman an extraordinary set of leather strips. There are 15 or 16 of them, blackened by age, inscribed in the old Paleo-Hebrew script that predates the square Hebrew alphabet used in most Torah manuscripts. The Bedouin tells him they were found in a cave high above the Wadi Mujib, the biblical Arnon, on the east side of the Dead Sea, in what is now Jordan. Shapira examines the strips. What he reads on them is bizarre. It is a version of the biblical book of Deuteronomy, but not the version anyone has ever seen. Certain laws are missing. The 10 Commandments are rendered in the first person, spoken by God directly. And there is an extra commandment that appears nowhere in any known biblical text. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. I am God, your God. Shapira believes he has found something staggering. Not a copy of Deuteronomy, but an earlier version of it. Perhaps something close to the original manuscript written in a script far older than anything else in existence. In 1883, Shapira brings the strips to Europe. He first shows them to German scholars, including Hermann Strack, who almost immediately declares them a forgery. Undeterred, Shapira takes them to London. He offers them to the British Museum for the price of £1 million, an enormous sum in Victorian England. The British Museum agrees to examine them on July 26, 1883, at the Palestine Exploration Fund offices. Shapira displays the strips to a room full of British scholars. He even tears off a portion of one strip to demonstrate the interior condition of the leather. Then, too, strips are moved to the British Museum for public exhibition. Thousands of Londoners file past them. The excitement is enormous. And then, disaster. Charles Simon Claremont Ganneau, one of the most respected biblical scholars in Europe, is invited to examine the strips. Shapira, aware of Claremont Ganneau's reputation as a hoax buster, restricts his access. He is not allowed to see the other 13 strips, only the 2 on display. Claremont Ganneau examines them anyway. Within days, he publicly declares them forgeries. His argument is technical, but devastating. He claims the strips were cut from the bottom margin of a genuine Yemenite Torah scroll that Shapira himself had previously sold to the British Museum. Shapira, Claremont Ganneau, alleges had chemically aged the leather and forged the inscriptions himself. The eminent British scholar Christian David Ginsburg reaches the same conclusion. The scandal explodes across Europe. Newspapers denounce Shapira as a fraud. Punch magazine ridicules him with anti-Semitic caricatures. His reputation is destroyed within weeks. Shapira flees London in shame. He wanders across Europe, drifting from city to city, sinking into despair. On March 9th, 1884, in a hotel room in Rotterdam, Moses, Wilhelm Shapira shoots himself in the head. He is buried in an unmarked grave. The strips are sold at auction for a few pounds. They pass through several hands and eventually disappear. They are believed to have been destroyed in a house fire, though there is no definitive record of their end. And that is where the story sits for the next 60 years. Until 1947. In that year, a Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat in caves above the Dead Sea in the same general region where Shapira's strips had allegedly come from, discovers ancient scrolls stuffed inside pottery jars. The Dead Sea Scrolls. These scrolls, once dated, proved to be genuinely 2,000 years old. They contain biblical texts, sectarian writings, and versions of scripture nobody had ever seen. And crucially, they demonstrate something that Clermont-Ganneau and the entire Victorian scholarly community had considered impossible in 1883. Ancient Hebrew leather scrolls can survive for millennia in the caves above the Dead Sea. The very premise of Clermont-Ganneau's denunciation that no ancient leather manuscript could have survived in that environment was wrong. In the wake of the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries, some scholars began revisiting Shapira. Menahem Mansour, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, published a serious 1956 defense of Shapira's strips, arguing they may have been authentic. Then, in March of 2021, biblical scholar Aidan Dershowitz of the University of Potsdam published a major study in the German journal Zeitschrift für die Alttestamentliche Wissenschaft, arguing, based on the surviving 19th century transcriptions and drawings of the strips, that they were almost certainly genuine and that they represent the oldest known version of Deuteronomy, an ancestor text that predates the version we have today. Dershowitz's arguments are technical and detailed. He examined the linguistic features, the theological content, and the paleography preserved in old photographs. He concluded that a 19th century forger would not have had the knowledge, the sources, or the sophistication to fake certain features that align with textual evidence uncovered only decades after Shapira's death. Not all scholars agree. There is a serious camp, including researchers who have written thoughtful rebuttals arguing that the strips were forgeries and that Dershowitz has overstated his case. In 2022, researchers physically examined the Yemenite Torah scrolls Shapira had previously sold to the British Museum. The ones Clermont-Ganneau had claimed provided the leather for the fake, and found that the margins were too small to have supplied the material. The debate is not settled, but it is no longer a foregone conclusion that Shapira was a fraud. What we know for certain is this. Moses Wilhelm Shapira died believing his life's greatest discovery had been rejected because scholars refused to consider that ancient scrolls could survive in the deserts of the Dead Sea. If Dershowitz and the newer camp are correct, Shapira had in his possession what would have been the oldest surviving biblical manuscript in the world, decades before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the strips were sold for pennies, then lost forever. His denunciation would rank among the costliest expert errors in the history of biblical scholarship, and he shot himself over it in a Rotterdam hotel. Number 3. The James Ossuary. In October of 2002, in the pages of Biblical Archaeology Review magazine, a Sorbonne paleographer named André Lemaire announces a discovery that stops the Christian world in its tracks. A limestone ossuary, a burial box used in 1st century Judea to hold the bones of the dead, has been found in the private collection of an Israeli antiquities collector named Oded Golan. The ossuary is unremarkable in shape and size. What is remarkable is the inscription carved into one side in Aramaic script, Yaakov bar Yosef Akui de Yeshua, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. If the inscription is authentic, and if the James it refers to is the James who is described in the New Testament as the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, then this ossuary would be the first physical archaeological trace ever discovered of Jesus' own family. It would be, without exaggeration, the most important Christian relic to surface in modern archaeology. Biblical Archaeology Review announces it on the cover. The Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto exhibits the ossuary. Millions of people file past the box in the following months. Christian pilgrims weep, scholars publish, the world, briefly, catches its breath, and then the Israel Antiquities Authority, or IAA, decides to investigate. In 2003, an IAA committee formally declares the inscription a forgery. They argue that while the ossuary itself is a genuine 1st century burial box, inscription, particularly the second half, brother of Jesus, was added in modern times using cleverly aged tools. In December of 2004, Oded Golan is arrested and charged with forgery, fraud, and multiple other offenses. Also charged is Antiquities dealer Robert Deutsch. Golan and Deutsch are accused of running one of the largest antiquities forgery operations in Israeli history. The James Ossuary is only one of several artifacts they are alleged to have faked, including a stone tablet known as the Jehoash inscription, which purports to describe temple repairs during the reign of King Jehoash, and which, if genuine, would be the only known physical inscription from the First Temple period. What follows is the longest, most complex forgery trial in Israeli history. It runs for 7 years. It hears from 138 witnesses. It produces over 12,000 pages of transcript, and it makes the mistake of trying to prosecute a question that scholars have not been able to settle in the labs, in the criminal courts, using rules of evidence designed for far simpler questions. The prosecution's case rests on the analysis of the patina, the thin natural crust that develops on stone over centuries. Their experts argue that the patina inside the letters of the Brother of Jesus portion of the inscription is chemically different from the patina on the rest of the ossuary. It is, they say, a fake patina, a modern paste applied to make the inscription look old. The defense produces its own experts, some of them world-class. Andre Lemaire himself, along with the renowned Harvard epigrapher Frank Moore Cross, argue that the inscription was carved by a single hand in a single sitting, using consistent letter forms. Other experts testify that they found ancient patina inside the letters of the disputed portion, including a member of the original IAA committee named Orna Cohen, whose findings were reportedly disregarded when they did not fit the prosecution's narrative. On March 14, 2012, Judge Aharon Farkash of the Jerusalem District Court delivers his verdict. It is 474 pages long, and it acquits Golan and Deutsch of all major forgery charges. Golan is convicted only of a minor charge of dealing in antiquities without a proper license. But the judge is careful in his ruling. He writes explicitly that his verdict is not a determination that the inscription is authentic. It is only a determination that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was forged. He states, all that has been established is that the tools and the science currently at the disposal of the experts who testified were not sufficient to prove the alleged forgeries beyond a reasonable doubt. The James Ossuary is neither cleared nor condemned. It sits in a legal and archaeological limbo. If it is real, it may be the most important Christian relic on earth. If it is a modern forgery, it is one of the most technically brilliant fakes ever produced. The scholarly community remains divided. Some accept the inscription as ancient. Others remain convinced it is modern. In 2019, the IAA was still fighting to retain custody of the artifact. Oded Golan continues to insist it is authentic. He continues to insist he purchased the ossuary in the 1970s from an East Jerusalem Antiquities dealer and had no idea what the inscription said until years later. The ossuary itself, when it is not on display, sits in the vaults of the Israel Antiquities Authority. It is one of the strangest objects in the world. A stone box that either contained the bones of a man named James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, or contained the bones of some unrelated first-century Jew before someone in the modern era carved into it words worth millions of dollars and shook the foundations of Christian history. And the courts, the labs, and the scholars have all effectively given up trying to decide. Number 2. The Grolier Codex, now officially called the Codex Maya of Mexico. This one flips the script. Because for 45 years, the mainstream archaeological establishment insisted this Maya bark paper book was a forgery, and they were wrong. In 1965, in a cave in the mountains of Chiapas, Mexico, looters allegedly discovered a bundle of ancient objects. The find included wooden masks, obsidian knives, and a bark paper folded manuscript in the classic screenfold style of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The manuscript had 11 surviving pages. The looters sold the objects to Mexican collector Josue Sáenz. Sáenz was told the story by intermediaries. He was intrigued enough to purchase the manuscript, but skeptical enough to run it past experts. He showed it in 1966 to 2 archaeologists, and their initial reaction was uncertain. Sáenz then loaned the codex to the Grolier Club in New York City, where it was displayed in 1971 alongside 3 other authenticated Maya codices, the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex. These three are the only surviving Maya books from the pre-conquest era that scholars had unanimously agreed were genuine. The Spanish conquistadors, believing the Maya books contained satanic content, burned nearly all of them in the 16th century. The three authenticated codices are among the greatest treasures of pre-Columbian archaeology, and the newly arrived Grolier Codex, as it came to be called, seemed to be a fourth. Almost immediately, the archaeological establishment turned on it. In 1973, the leading Maya scholar J. Eric Thompson called the Grolier a forgery. Thompson argued the iconography was crude, the astronomical content was suspect, and that the codex had emerged not from a proper excavation, but from looters with an obvious profit motive. His judgment carried enormous weight. Because Thompson was Thompson, most of the field agreed. The Grolier Codex was consigned to the category of dubious antiquities. Science eventually returned it to Mexican authorities in 1974, and it went into storage in the vaults of the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. It was not displayed, it was not studied, it was, essentially, buried a second time. But not everyone was convinced. The Yale anthropologist Michael Coe, one of the giants of Maya scholarship, believed the codex was genuine from the moment he first saw it. He said as much repeatedly over the decades. He was ignored. Then, slowly, the science caught up. Radiocarbon dating of the codex's bark paper, or amidal, dated the material to somewhere between 1021 and 1154 AD. That alone was suggestive. But it did not prove the drawings on the paper were genuine, since a forger could theoretically obtain ancient paper. The key breakthrough came from the pigments. Analysis of the blue pigment on the Grolier Codex identified it as authentic Maya blue. Maya blue is one of the most remarkable pigments in the history of art. It is a chemically stable, unfading blue produced by combining indigo dye with a rare clay mineral called palygorskite in a specific heated ratio. Modern chemists could not fully understand the process by which the Maya produced Maya blue until the 1990s. The chemistry, the exact fusion of organic and inorganic components, was only reverse engineered in laboratories decades after the Grolier Codex was denounced as a fake. No forger in 1965 could have known the recipe for Maya blue. It was chemically impossible for the manuscript to be a modern fake and still contain that specific pigment. That was the smoking gun. Then researchers looked at the iconography. Certain Maya deities depicted in the Grolier Codex, including a mountain god shown with a split head, were not part of the recognized Maya pantheon in 1965. These figures were only identified through archaeological discoveries and epigraphic breakthroughs in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. But there they were in the Grolier, drawn correctly, decades before scholars knew they existed. A forger cannot fake what nobody has yet discovered. In 2016, a team led by Stephen Houston of Brown University with collaboration from Michael Coe, Mary Miller of Yale, and Carl Taude of UC Riverside published a comprehensive study in the journal Maya Archaeology 3. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The Grolier Codex is genuine. The paper, the pigments, the iconography, and the calendrical astronomy all cohere. It is one of only 4 authenticated Maya screenfold manuscripts in existence. And because its radiocarbon dates place it in the 11th or early 12th century AD, it is the oldest of the 4, which means the Grolier Codex, formerly denounced as a fake, for 45 years is the oldest surviving book ever produced in the Americas. It has now been renamed the Codice Maya de Mexico. It sits, at last, in the Mexican National Museum of Anthropology, officially recognized. And this entry is here for a specific reason, because when we build lists of famous fakes, we forget that some of the most confident denunciations have been wrong. Some of the most authoritative scholars in the field spent decades insisting the Grolier was a forgery, and every single one of them was mistaken. That should make us humble about the current consensus on every other object in every other museum. The forgeries we exposed and the forgeries we imagined. Both categories deserve caution. Number 1. The Persian Princess. This is the story that reminds us that the world of illicit antiquities is not always about art. Sometimes it is about a body. October 19th, 2000. The Pakistani port city of Karachi. Police, following up on a tip about a black market videotape circulating among antiquities dealers, arrest a man named Ali Akbar. The tape shows Akbar boasting about a mummy he has for sale, an ancient one, royal, priceless. The asking price is $11 million US. Under interrogation, Akbar leads police across the country into Baluchistan, the arid mountainous province that borders Iran and Afghanistan. In the town of Karan, they raid the compound of a tribal leader named Wali Muhammad Reiki. And there, in a wooden crate in Reiki's house, they find her. She is lying inside a heavily decorated wooden sarcophagus. The coffin is inscribed with cuneiform, the Wedge script of ancient Persia. It is carved with images of Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian supreme deity. Inside the coffin, wrapped in Egyptian-style linen bindings, is a mummified body. Around her neck rests a golden breastplate, and on that breastplate is engraved a message in Old Persian. I am the daughter of the great King Xerxes. Mazarika, protect me. I am Rodagoon, I am. On her head is a golden crown embossed with 7 intertwined cypress trees. Everything about the discovery is astonishing, because there is one enormous problem immediately visible to any historian. The Persians did not mummify. Ancient Persia, dominated by Zoroastrianism, treated the body as spiritually impure after death. Zoroastrian burial traditionally involved exposure of the corpse to scavenging birds on structures called Towers of Silence. No royal Persian mummy had ever been found, because they should not exist. Reiki tells police he acquired the mummy from an Iranian man named Sharif Shah Baki, who claimed to have discovered it in a tomb exposed by an earthquake. Baki has since vanished. Nobody can locate him. The mummy is transported to the National Museum in Karachi. Pakistani archaeologist Ahmad Hassan Dani gives a triumphant press conference declaring the find one of the greatest of the century. He proposes theories to explain the mummification. Perhaps she was an Egyptian princess married to a Persian prince. Perhaps she was the daughter of Cyrus the Great. Perhaps she was, as the inscription claims, a daughter of Xerxes. And immediately an international crisis erupts. Iran claims the mummy is Iranian cultural property, illegally trafficked out of the country. Pakistan claims the mummy was found in Pakistan and belongs to the Pakistani state. The Taliban, then still in power, in Afghanistan briefly claims the mummy might have originated in Afghan territory. For weeks, there is genuine diplomatic tension between 3 nations over a mummified body that everyone assumes is 2,600 years old. And then the science begins. In November of 2000, before Christmas, the mummy is taken to Aga Khan University Hospital in Karachi for a CT scan. The results are the first alarm. The CT scan reveals a young woman, roughly 20 to 25 years old at death, with a broken spine and evidence of blunt force trauma to the neck. Her organs have been removed, but not in the ancient Egyptian manner. In Egyptian mummification, organs were carefully extracted through specific small incisions, then preserved and placed in canopic jars alongside the body. This woman's organs had been removed roughly, and her body cavity had been packed with a powdery substance later identified as a mixture of baking soda and common salt. A crude, modern mummification. The next alarm came from the linguists. An Italian expert examined the cuneiform inscription on the golden breastplate. There were grammatical errors, multiple errors that would have been unthinkable in a genuine royal Persian inscription intended to be read by the gods. And there was a specific problem with the name. The princess called herself Rodagoon. Rodagoon is a Greek transliteration of an Old Persian name. In an actual ancient Persian royal inscription, the name would have been rendered in its original Persian form, Wardagana, not the Greek version. A native Persian scribe from the court of Xerxes would never have used the Greek form of his own princess's name on her own coffin. The linguistic evidence pointed to a forger who knew ancient Persian well enough to fake an inscription, but not well enough to catch that specific detail. Then came the radiocarbon dating. The reed mats included in the burial were tested. They dated to no more than 50 years old. The sarcophagus wood, subjected to further analysis, showed tool marks from modern instruments. It could not be more than around 25 years old. And then, catastrophically, the body itself was radiocarbon dated. The results indicated a date of death around 1996, 4 years before her discovery. This was not a princess, this was a modern corpse. The autopsy, conducted by Pakistani archaeologist Asma Ibrahim and her team, revealed more disturbing details. The woman's teeth had been removed after death. Her hip joint, pelvis, and backbone had been damaged, likely during the extraction of her organs. Her spine was fractured. The cause of death, most likely, was a broken neck. On April 17, 2001, the Pakistani National Museum issued its official 11-page report prepared by Dr. Ibrahim, declaring the Persian Princess a modern forgery. The find of the century had lasted 6 months. Pakistani police opened a murder investigation. The question was no longer who this princess was, it was who this young woman had been. Was she a body robbed from a fresh grave and then mummified by a forgery ring, or had she been murdered explicitly to be turned into a fake antiquity? The police interrogated the men in the smuggling chain, Ali Akbar, Wali Muhammad Reiki, others, but the Iranian man, Sharif Shahbaki, who had allegedly provided the mummy in the first place, could never be located. He may have never existed. He may have been a name invented to protect whoever was actually responsible. No suspect has ever been arrested for her murder. No family has ever come forward to identify her. She is a young woman, roughly 21 years old, who died sometime around 1996, somewhere in the vast borderlands of Iran, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, and whose body was taken by criminals, disemboweled, packed with baking soda, dressed in a fake royal costume, and offered for sale on the international black market for $11 million. She was, in every sense, someone. A daughter, possibly a sister, possibly a wife. Somewhere, there is a family that never learned what happened to her. The remains sat in a Pakistani government facility for years, while officials debated what to do with a modern murder victim whose body had also become an object of criminal evidence. Finally, the Eddy Foundation, a Pakistani humanitarian charity, took custody. In 2005, they announced they would give her a proper burial, but bureaucratic delays kept her body in limbo. Not until 2008, 8 years after her discovery, was she finally interred with proper burial rites in a graveyard for unidentified corpses in Karachi. She has no name on her stone. She is not the daughter of Xerxes. She is not Roduguno. She is a young woman whose name we may never know, whose murder remains unsolved, and whose body was one of the most successful antiquity hoaxes of the modern era until the CT scan told the truth. And that is why she sits at the top of this list. Because when a lie about the past is expensive enough, someone in the present pays a price no artifact ever could. She was the fake, she was also the crime, and nobody has ever been held accountable for either. 10 objects, 10 lies. Some were exposed by chemistry, like the manganese in the Etruscan warriors, or the carborundum on the Smithsonian's crystal skull. Some were exposed by paperwork, like the postal code on the Getty Kouros letter that outed a document written 20 years too early. Some were exposed by confessions, like the goldsmith who traveled from Odessa to Paris to prove he made a Scythian king's crown, or the elderly Italian sculptor who walked into a U.S. consulate with a broken thumb in his pocket. Some, like the James Ossuary, were never truly resolved and probably never will be, and some, like the Grolier Codex, were denounced for 45 years before the world realized it had been wrong about them all along. The lesson underneath all of this is not that museums are unreliable. Most of what sits behind glass in the world's great institutions is exactly what the placard says it is. The lesson is that the desire to touch the past is one of the most powerful forces in human beings, and forgers understand that desire better than anyone. They do not sell fakes to skeptics. They sell fakes to believers. They sell what people already want to be true. The Cardiff Giant was sold to a nation that wanted biblical giants to walk the earth. The crystal skulls were sold to a Victorian Europe that wanted Aztec priests to have channeled dark powers through translucent quartz. The Persian Princess was sold to a black market that wanted a lost royal daughter of Xerxes because such a discovery would have been priceless. Every hoax on this list started with someone wanting to believe, and someone else knowing exactly what to build. If this documentary rewired the way you think about the objects in museums, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to push this video out to more people who love genuine ancient history and want to know when the story behind the glass isn't quite what the placard says. Subscribe to Ancient Ralph and turn on notifications so you never miss the next investigation. And drop a comment. Tell me which of these fakes shocked you the most. Was it the family in the Bolton Garden shed who outcrafted the British Museum? The Louvre paying millions for a jeweler's commission from Odessa? Or the woman who was murdered and packaged as a daughter of Xerxes on the Antiquities black market? Let me know where you're watching from, because our community stretches across every continent, and every viewer here is part of what keeps this channel digging into the stories textbooks leave out. If you want more forgotten history, our next investigation goes deep into another shocking case: the ancient artifacts that were secretly moved during the Second World War and never returned to their countries of origin. Some are still missing. Some are hiding in plain sight. Thank you for watching. History remembers what survives, but sometimes what survives is a lie.